Female sexuality encompasses a broad range of behaviours, including female sexual identity and sexual behaviour, the physiological, psychological, social, cultural, political, and spiritual or religious aspects of sexual activity. Everything from the act of sex to a female's sexual identity to the way society accepts this sexuality falls under this umbrella. As we've already established, so many kinds of content imagines what our future is going to look like, especially science fiction or speculative fiction. And speculative fiction has a really rich history with exploring themes like what sexuality looks like in the future. Sci-fi is uniquely positioned to imagine changed elements of our real world and speculate on what it could be like in the future if things were different, like if we didn't live in a heteronormative or patriarchal society, or what sex with robots and alien creatures is like, where reproductive technology will end up, changing gender roles, changes in sexual biology, a rejection of monogamy or a rejection of sexuality as a whole. All of these worlds are possible for exploration through the sci-fi lens. Some sci-fi films have explored the addition of artificial intelligence to our relationships and sexual encounters, like in Her and Blade Runner 2049. Others have looked at the proliferation of sex robots, like in Westworld, Ex Machina, and AI artificial intelligence. Science fiction is full of predictions and imaginings about sex that sometimes conform and sometimes deviate from what is conventional. Female sexuality is sitting at an interesting crossroads between women being more sexually liberated and empowered than ever before, and parts of society reacting to this empowerment with fear and hostility. Positively, the Me Too movement has drawn attention to the sexual assault of women in various industries and created a societal discussion and shift towards believing women about sexual assault and changing the standards of how women's sexuality is traditionally treated. While these are all positives for the state of female sexuality in the world today, there have also been troubling reactions. A study of young Australians aged 16 to 24 revealed some concerning findings. Nearly 1/4 of respondents agreed that women tend to exaggerate the problem of male violence. 1 in 7 said that women often make false allegations of sexual assault, and 1 in 8 weren't aware non-consensual sex in marriage was a criminal offence. A recent survey found that while in 1994, 83% of young men rejected the conventional gender role of man as breadwinner, this number had fallen to 55% in 2014. So female sexuality in the real world is a little all over the place. While some would argue female sexuality is accepted more than ever before, some attitudes about sexuality are not changing. When looking at how the genre of science fiction typically handles the question of female sexuality, things are usually, repeat after me, not good. Up to the 1980s, women were pretty much just sex objects or romantic partners in sci-fi films. In the late 70s, 80s and 90s, there was a bit of a shift, and women who were decision-making characters with a will of their own started appearing in the genre, which can be attributed to the 1960s and 70s second-wave feminism and its demands for recognition and equality in the public sphere. However, it can be argued that women have remained marginalised in contemporary science fiction, with active female characters being introduced in the science fiction genre as an act of feminist tokenism, giving the illusion that women have gained power. However, they are almost systematically marginalised, so that their main function is in fact to act as mirrors that reflect the male hero. This tokenism is extremely evident when looking at how the genre often handles sexuality. Looking at Blade Runner 2049, every character is either a replicant slave or sex slave, prostitute, or is evil. Even Joy, who is positioned as the love interest of the film, is a program owned by the protagonist. Even though the film frames it as love, she is technically his object to own. So many women in sci-fi are pigeonholed into these very one-dimensional roles where they are just sexualized. Even when female characters are written well, like Ripley in Alien, their sexuality is still front and center, with shots purely made for the male gaze and the use of conventionally attractive actresses to play the roles. And then there is the Born Sexy Yesterday trope, coined by Pop Culture Detective. Definitely go and check out that video, I'll link it in the description. But basically, in a nutshell, the trope is when the mind of a naive yet highly skilled girl is written into the body of a mature, sexualized woman. Born Sexy Yesterday is about an unbalanced relationship between a man and a woman. You've definitely seen this trope in all kinds of sci-fi films because Born Sexy Yesterday is really applicable to the sci-fi genre. Alien women, created women, AI, women from other worlds. The worlds in science fiction allow audiences to sort of excuse this very real sexism because they are such new and different worlds. In addition to this, speculative fiction, particularly in literature but also on screen, is very reliant on using sexual assault and violence as plot drivers and character arcs. The television version of Westworld has had a lot of people questioning the use of sexual violence against women as plot points and in ways that are arguably not justified for the story. In an op-ed about the proliferation of sexual violence against women in the science fiction genre, one writer documented that in a small anecdotal test she did, of the 31 science fiction and fantasy novels she'd read which had a female protagonist, 20 had at least one scene involving sexual violence. Interestingly, many of the futures imagined in science fiction still have traditional elements. There's still monogamy, heteronormativity, traditional family structures. All in all, a lot of science fiction movies aren't doing a whole lot of interesting stuff with female sexuality or exploring it in any real way. This is a direct contrast with how sexuality is playing out presently and how it's actually predicted to turn out in the future. When it comes to sexuality as a whole for society, I found that futurologists tend to predict three main things over and over again. A future where sex and romantic love has fundamentally changed in some way, where gender is increasingly unimportant, and where we are having a lot of sex with robots. James Hughes predicts that monogamy is out the window, that body sex, so physical human-to-human intercourse, will become about as exciting as stirring tepid tea with your finger, because we will all be experimenting with all other kinds of sex, virtual, robotic, artificial, etc., all the time. And that biological gender will cease to be important, and people will tweak elements of their gender to fit trends. Another futurologist, Ian Pearson, released a report where he predicted that human-on-robot sex was going to be more popular than human-to-human sex by 2050. The millennial generation is becoming more and more tolerant of same-sex experiences, bisexuality, gender fluidity, and all sorts of other ways of living that fall outside the traditional binaries of straight and gay, male and female, which means the future could be heading to a place which is less defined by these parameters as well. So how accurate are our sci-fi films getting it? Well, if the future of sexuality and sex revolves around robots, things aren't looking too positive for female sexuality. In this article for Quartz, it's outlined pretty comprehensively that while there is a massive market for sex robots for women, the industry is pretty much just focusing on making these kind of technologies for men, even though neglecting half the market seems a bit odd. But tech has traditionally been made by men for men. If sexuality is truly heading in this direction, it raises all kinds of alarming questions about what this is going to do to female sexuality in the real world in the future as well. Like, what happens to consent in a world where sometimes you're having sex with a human being and sometimes you're having sex with a robot, which can or cannot consent depending on where you come at it ethically and morally. Going against the move to polyamory and untraditional relationships that futurists predict, most sci-fi films still have elements of monogamy, romantic love, or some kind of traditional adjacent structure, a wife and a husband, two people in a committed relationship, a parent and a child, etc. This is an example of galactic suburbia, a term coined by Joanna Russ, who thought that it was super weird that sci-fi often explored worlds with new scientific and technological futures, but it didn't change any other elements of society. Futurists also predict less emphasis placed on gender, which is also not reflected in a lot of sci-fi films. Stories are still very heteronormative, and people still mostly present traditionally female or male in most worlds. So all in all, sci-fi has a ways to go with representing female sexuality, which isn't much of a surprise as their representation of women as a whole isn't great. And even at the best of times, society has a difficult time appropriately addressing female sexuality, let alone in a medium which is already notorious for messing up the portrayal of women and women's issues. See you next time.